I've kept that small metal object in my drawer for more than 30 years now, tucked beneath old letters and ticket stubs I no longer remember collecting. But whenever I open that drawer, I pause. My fingers brush against it as if the cold surface still holds a fraction of that winter night in Montana, when a stranger stepped out of the dark and insisted I must never lose it. He didn't threaten me. He didn't even raise his voice. He just said my life would depend on it someday, and the certainty in his eyes was more chilling than the wind around us. Back then, I thought he was just another drifter passing through our small town, someone looking for a story to tell or a place to warm up. The object itself seemed almost laughable, ordinary, unremarkable, a thing anyone else would have tossed into the nearest trash bin without a second thought. But he held it like it was something fragile, something sacred. And when he placed it in my hands, I felt an odd weight to it, as if I wasn't just holding metal, but time itself. I tried to ask him who he was, where he had come from, why he cared so much about something that looked worthless. He gave me a quiet smile, sad, relieved, and strangely familiar, and said I wouldn't believe him even if he told me. He said he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time, which made no sense to me then. A long time. He couldn't have known me, yet he spoke like someone who did. That night he vanished the same way he appeared, silently, as though the darkness swallowed him whole. I walked home clutching the object, annoyed with myself for letting a stranger's intensity get under my skin. I told myself I would forget him by morning, but as I crossed the empty road, I had the strange sense that something had shifted, like a thread had been pulled loose in the fabric of my life. I didn't understand any of it then, not who he was, not why he seemed afraid for me, not why he insisted that the object mattered. But years later, on a day I still struggle to talk about, I finally understood everything he had tried to warn me about. My name is Evan Porter, and back in 1992, I was 22 years old and working part-time at a small hardware store just off the state highway. Life in rural Montana had a quiet rhythm to it. Days shaped by long drives, the hiss of wind across the open fields, and the soft hum of the radio in my truck. Nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen out there. Nothing that could prepare me for the night when everything shifted. I remember standing outside the store after closing, watching the last traces of daylight fade behind the pines. It was cold enough that my breath lingered in the air. That was when he approached me, calm, steady, as if he had stepped out of the dusk itself. He carried the metal object cupped in both hands, like someone carrying an injured bird. He said he'd been looking for me. He said this object belonged with me, even though I'd never seen it before. I thought he was confused, maybe lost, maybe desperate. But the way he spoke, the way he pronounced my name without hesitation, made my chest tighten. He told me I wouldn't understand that night, and I didn't. Not until decades later, when everything he hinted at became painfully clear. I didn't want to believe him. I didn't want to accept anything unusual happening in my life, but something about the way he looked at me, like he was carrying years of memories I hadn't lived yet, kept me awake that night long after I went home. I wish I'd asked him more. I wish I'd understood sooner, because the moment he placed that object in my hand, the future I thought I knew quietly unraveled. Hi, my name is Evan. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd be grateful if you could subscribe to the channel. Have you ever held on to something without knowing why it mattered? Thank you for being here with me. Now let's go back to the story. I didn't sleep well the night he handed me the object. Montana nights were usually quiet enough that I could drift off with the window cracked open, letting the cold air settle over me like a blanket. But that night, I kept turning the small piece of metal in my hand, feeling its weight shift with each movement. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just a round, dull piece of machined steel with a groove etched down the center, like it had once been part of something larger. Maybe a tool, maybe a component, maybe even scrap. But the way he gave it to me, it didn't feel like scrap. I set it on my nightstand, but even then, I felt its presence. You know how sometimes an object seems to take up more space in your awareness than it does physically? How you keep glancing at it, expecting it to change or reveal something. That's how it felt. I kept hearing his voice, steady, certain, telling me not to lose it, telling me my safety depended on it. Those words had wrapped themselves around my thoughts so tightly that no amount of reasoning could untangle them. By morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. People say strange things in small towns. Wanderers drift in and out. You hear stories about odd encounters out in the plains, someone speaking in riddles, someone claiming to know things they shouldn't. Maybe he was just another eccentric. Maybe he'd been cold, hungry, confused. That explanation suited the version of the world I understood. The alternative was too heavy to carry. When I arrived at the hardware store the next morning, the first thing I did was show the object to my boss, Tom Rivers. Tom had been working there since the 70s. If something had a screw, a bolt, or a hinge, Tom could probably tell you the year it was manufactured and what machine it came from. If anyone could identify the object, it was him. He held it between his fingers, squinting through his thick glasses. "Doesn't look like anything we sell," he muttered. "Where'd you get it?" "Some guy gave it to me last night." Tom raised an eyebrow. "And you took it?" "I didn't have much of a choice," I said. He seemed serious about it. Tom turned it around a few more times, tapping it gently on the counter. "Could be a bearing housing from a tractor, but the cut is too clean. Doesn't match any of the parts we carry. Looks custom." "Custom for what?" I asked. "No idea. I've never seen anything quite like it." He slid it back to me with a shrug. If it meant something to him, maybe it's just sentimental. Folks hold on to odd things. "Maybe," I said, but the weight in my stomach told me otherwise. I slipped the object into my coat pocket and spent the rest of the morning stocking shelves. The store was always quiet in winter, and the hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. Normally that sound faded into the background, but that day it only made my thoughts louder. Every time metal clinked in the bins, screws, washers, bolts, I found myself turning toward the sound, half expecting something to click into place inside me, like I was supposed to recognize the object but simply couldn't. Around noon, a customer walked in, and I nearly dropped the box I was carrying. For a split second, I thought it was him, the stranger from the night before. The same build, the same calm presence. But when the man turned his head, I realized it wasn't him. Still, my pulse had already begun to race. The stranger from the night before hadn't just unsettled me. He'd left me with a sense of unfinished business, like I'd walked out of a conversation halfway through a sentence. Every face in town suddenly looked like a potential continuation of that moment. At lunch, I sat in my truck with the heater running, holding the metal object in my hands. The cold of it seeped into my skin. I tried turning it, angling it toward the light, hoping it would reveal something. But it remained silent, unhelpful, stubbornly ordinary. The only thing unusual about it was the feeling it gave me, a feeling I didn't have words for yet. I told myself I would stop thinking about it. I'd go home, put it in a drawer, and forget it like the dozens of random things we all accumulate over the years. But even then, a part of me knew that wasn't going to happen. That evening, I drove home with the object resting on the passenger seat, as if giving it its own place would somehow make sense of the situation. The sky was a washed-out blue, the kind that arrives after a long winter day when the light fades before you're ready to let it go. I kept glancing at the object whenever the truck hit a bump in the road, half expecting it to roll or shift or do anything that might offer a clue about what it was meant for. Nothing happened. It just sat there, cold and indifferent. But even in its silence, it felt like it was watching me. When I got home, I placed it on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of coffee. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the sink. Normally I found that sound comforting. That night it only reminded me of how slowly time seemed to be moving. I pulled out a chair and sat across from the object, studying it under the warm light. Its surface looked smoother than I remembered, the metal almost polished in certain angles. "Why would he care so much about you?" I whispered to it, feeling ridiculous as soon as the words left my mouth. It didn't answer, of course, but something inside me tightened, as if I had asked the wrong question. Maybe it wasn't about the object itself. Maybe it was about the moment he gave it to me. I tried replaying every second in my mind. The look in his eyes, the way he said my name, the way he held the object like it was something fragile. I didn't know him, yet he seemed to know me. Not casually, not vaguely, intimately, the kind of familiarity that comes from time, not chance. The longer I sat there, the more a strange discomfort crawled into my chest. I finally picked up the object and carried it to my bedroom. I opened the drawer beside the bed, a small wooden one filled with things I rarely used. Spare keys, old receipts, a photo I had taken on a fishing trip years earlier. I slipped the object inside and closed the drawer with a soft thud. There, I muttered. Out of sight, out of mind. But the moment I turned off the lights and lay down, my mind betrayed me. Every time I tried to think about something else, work, errands, bills, the memory of the stranger forced its way back in. His voice echoed like a soft warning. Don't lose it. You'll need it. At some point I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I dreamed of a snowy road stretching endlessly in both directions. I stood in the middle of it, holding the metal object in my hand. But in the dream it felt warm, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. A figure appeared at the edge of the road, the same stranger from the night before. He didn't speak. He just watched me with an expression that blended sadness and urgency. I tried to walk toward him, but the snow beneath my feet shifted like sand. The more I struggled, the further he seemed to drift away. When I woke, my shirt was damp with sweat. The drawer was closed, exactly as I'd left it, but something told me I needed to check. I got up, crossed the room, and pulled it open. The metal object sat there, motionless, cold, lifeless, but I swear it looked slightly out of place, like it had been nudged or rotated while I slept. I shook my head. I wasn't going to start imagining things. I was tired, that was all. I got ready for work and tried to shake off the dream, but as I stepped outside into the morning air, the world felt misaligned. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. Maybe it was the weight of uncertainty. Or maybe, though I didn't want to admit it, it was because some part of me was starting to believe the stranger hadn't been lying. As I drove away, I caught myself glancing in the rearview mirror far too often, half expecting to see him standing by the road again, waiting for me with that same heavy expression. But the road behind me remained empty, quiet, and impossibly still. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't gone far. Not really. That somehow, in ways I couldn't understand, he was still close, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally catch up to me. The following days blended together in a way that felt heavier than usual, as if each hour carried its own small weight. Life in a quiet Montana town doesn't normally shift much from day to day. Same roads, same faces, same rhythms. But something in me had changed, even if I couldn't admit it fully then. I kept trying to treat everything as normal, but the memory of that night pressed against the edges of my thoughts, refusing to fade. Every morning before work, I found myself opening the drawer just to look at the object. I would stare at it for a few seconds, feel that familiar discomfort rise in my chest, and then close the drawer again. I told myself it was just curiosity, just caution, but I knew that wasn't true. It felt more like the object had anchored itself to my life, silently demanding attention. On the third morning, something subtle happened, something I didn't talk about for years. I opened the drawer, and for a brief second, I thought the object wasn't there. It was only a trick of the shadows, the drawer opening at an angle that concealed it. But that momentary lapse hit me harder than it should have. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for it, relieved when my fingers finally brushed the cool surface. It didn't make sense to react that way. It was just metal, just an object, but I felt responsible for it, bound to it. That day at the store, Tom noticed something was off. "You look tired," he said, glancing at me over the counter. "Didn't sleep much," I replied, still thinking about that stranger. I tried to laugh it off. "Not really." But Tom's eyes narrowed slightly. "Evan, you sure? I've seen you rattled before, but this is different." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. At lunch, instead of eating in my truck like I usually did, I sat on the small bench behind the store. The mountains in the distance were dusted with fresh snow, and the cold air bit at my skin. I closed my eyes, tilting my head back, hoping the cold would clear my mind, but all it did was sharpen my memory of the stranger's voice. "You'll need it someday. Don't lose it." I opened my eyes abruptly and scanned the empty lot, half expecting him to be standing somewhere nearby. It was ridiculous, but the paranoia had settled deep in me. Every sound felt sharper, every movement more significant. Even the wind rustling through the dry grass made me tense. I forced myself to breathe evenly. "Get a grip," I whispered. "He's gone." But the unease didn't leave. That night, after work, I drove out to an overlook a few miles outside of town. It was a place I used to go when I needed to think. Just a small turnout with a view of the valley and the river winding through it like a thin ribbon of steel. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and let the silence wrap around me. For a moment, I felt grounded again. The sky was darkening, painted with shades of deep blue and purple. The air smelled of pine and distant snow. It reminded me of the Montana I knew, simple, quiet, steady. Then I saw headlights in the distance, approaching slowly along the road. My pulse quickened. As the vehicle drew closer, I leaned forward, trying to make out the silhouette of the driver, the shape of the car, the way it moved. Something about it tugged at my memory. But when it finally passed by, the driver was a middle-aged woman I didn't recognize. She didn't even glance my way. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, but the sense of being watched didn't disappear. Eventually, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the metal object, holding it up to what little light was left. In the dusk, it looked different, almost darker, as if the shadows clung to it. The groove down the center caught the faint light, creating a thin line that seemed to pulse with every beat of my heart. "I don't know what you are," I murmured, "or why he thought I needed you." The wind picked up, cutting across the valley in a long, low sigh. It felt like a warning, or maybe a reminder. I closed my hand around the object, letting its cold seep into my skin. That was the first night I allowed myself to wonder, really wonder, if the stranger had told the truth, if he truly knew something about my future, about danger, about time, and whether this small, unremarkable piece of metal was more than just metal. I didn't know it then, but the moment I acknowledged that possibility, the path ahead of me quietly shifted, just as he said it would. The next morning began like any other, but something about the air felt different, as if the world had shifted a fraction of an inch while I slept. I drove to work through a thin veil of fog rolling low over the fields, the kind that makes familiar roads look strangely foreign. The radio crackled with static for most of the drive, picking up only fragments of distant broadcasts. I remember thinking it was unusual, but not unusual enough to worry about. Not yet. When I arrived at the hardware store, Tom was already unlocking the front door. He looked over his shoulder when he heard my truck and gave me a small nod. "You're in early," he said. "Couldn't sleep again. That makes 3 nights in a row." "I know." He watched me for a moment, his expression softening. "Look, Evan, if something's bothering you, really bothering you, you can talk to me." I forced a smile. "I appreciate it. I'm just tired." Tom didn't push, but I could tell he didn't believe me. I tried to focus on work, stocking shelves and reorganizing the tool aisle, but nothing held my attention the way it should. Every metallic sound, a dropped screw, the clink of a wrench, made me think of the object in my drawer at home. I kept checking my watch as if expecting something to happen, some shift or sign. But the minutes passed like they always did, slow, ordinary, unremarkable. Around mid-morning, a customer walked in, a man I didn't recognize. He wore a long coat, a dark hat pulled low, and he moved with the kind of careful intention people use when they're searching for something specific. I glanced up from the counter, and for reasons I couldn't explain, my pulse surged. There was nothing special about him, nothing strange, but something in my memory stirred anyway, like a half-forgotten dream reaching for the surface. He wandered through the aisles for several minutes before approaching the counter. "You work here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Can I help you find something?" The man hesitated, then placed a small piece of paper on the counter. "I'm looking for something like this." I picked it up. It was a rough pencil sketch, quick, imprecise lines, slightly smudged. But even with the loose strokes and missing details, I recognized the shape immediately. It was the object. My hands froze around the paper. "Where did you get this?" I asked quietly. "Does it matter?" the man said. My throat tightened. "Why are you looking for it?" He tilted his head slightly, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "You've seen it, haven't you?" For a moment, the store felt too small, air too thin, walls too close. I heard the steady hum of the lights above me, the faint wind tapping at the windows. Every sound sharpened. "I didn't say that," I replied. "You didn't have to." Something in the man's tone pierced through my chest. Calm, confident, a certainty I recognized, though I wished I didn't. He leaned in slightly. "If you come across it, don't hold on to it longer than you're meant to." "Meant to?" I repeated. "What does that mean?" "Time has its own way of correcting things," he said quietly. "Even the smallest things." I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" But before he could answer, the front door opened, and Tom walked in from the loading dock carrying a box of new inventory. The stranger stepped back immediately, his demeanor shifting like a light being turned off. "Thanks for your help," he said, already heading toward the exit. "Wait," I called after him, but he didn't stop. He didn't even look back. By the time I reached the door, the parking lot was empty. No car, no footprints in the thin frost on the pavement. Nothing to prove he'd ever been there. Tom came up behind me. "Everything okay?" I stared at the empty space. "I'm not sure." When I walked back inside, my hands were still shaking. The sketch sat on the counter where the man had left it, the lines faint but unmistakable. I picked it up again, staring at the shape that had already begun to haunt my days and nights. Two people now, two strangers, both tied to the same object, and both somehow tied to me. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into my pocket, feeling its texture against my fingertips. Something in my life had cracked open, quietly but irreversibly, and for the first time, I felt the certainty settle deep in my chest. This wasn't a coincidence. It never had been. I spent the rest of the morning pretending to work, but my thoughts kept circling the same point. The second stranger knew about the object, not just vaguely. He'd sketched it. That meant he had seen it before, maybe even held it. Maybe he had been looking for it for a long time. Maybe both of them had. Every aisle I walked down, every box I opened, felt like moving through thick fog. At one point, I knocked over a stack of paint cans, the clattering echoing through the store. Tom hurried over, concern written all over his face. "You sure you're all right, Evan?" "Yeah," I lied. "Hands are just cold." He didn't press it, but I could feel his eyes on me for longer than usual. At lunch, I ducked into the small break room in the back, wanting privacy more than food. I pulled out the folded sketch from my pocket and laid it on the table. The lines were faint, rushed, but unmistakable. The same oval shape, the same central groove. The artist had even shaded the sides to show how the light curved across the metal. Why would someone come into a hardware store asking for something so specific? And why now? I stared at the drawing for so long that my eyes began to burn. Eventually, I pressed my palms against them, trying to steady my breathing. But when I lowered my hands again, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Two numbers lightly penciled at the bottom corner of the page. 14D. They were so small, I thought they were smudges at first. But no, someone had written them intentionally. What they meant, I had no idea. A date, a code, a location, a version. A version of what? By the time my lunch break ended, I didn't feel any closer to answers, only deeper into the question. When my shift finally ended, I drove home faster than I meant to. The roads were bare, no snow yet, but the sky was dim and metallic, reflecting the unease in my chest. As soon as I stepped inside the house, I went straight to my bedroom drawer. I opened it. The object was still there. But once again, just like the previous morning, it wasn't where I thought I'd left it. I always placed it carefully in the back left corner of the drawer, nested between the spare keys and an old compass I never used. But now it sat closer to the front, angled slightly, as if turned by a cautious hand. I didn't touch it at first. I just stared, heart thumping hard enough to feel in my throat. Maybe I had knocked the drawer earlier. Maybe vibrations from walking across the room had shifted things slightly. Old drawers moved sometimes, but the explanation felt thin, fragile. I finally reached in and picked it up. The metal was colder than it should have been after spending all day in a wooden drawer, cold enough to make my fingers ache. I sat on the edge of my bed, turning it slowly. The groove down the middle caught what little daylight remained. I traced the line with my thumb, feeling the subtle indentation. There was something almost familiar about the shape, like the memory of a word on the tip of my tongue. As I studied it, another thought crept in. Quiet, unwelcome. What if the second stranger wasn't here to warn me? What if he was here to take it? The idea made my skin prickle. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But the yard was empty, the trees still. I forced myself to breathe slowly. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, the object in front of me, a cup of coffee going cold beside my hand. I turned on the small lamp above the table, watching how the light slid across the metal. I picked up the sketch and placed it next to the object. Even with the rushed lines, the resemblance was exact. Too exact. Whoever had drawn it knew exactly what they were looking for. I thought of the first stranger, his quiet certainty, his sad eyes, the weight in his voice when he told me I'd need it. Then I thought of the second, the way he seemed to already know my answer before I spoke. The way he disappeared without a trace. Two men who didn't know each other. Two warnings that contradicted each other. Hold on to it. Don't hold on to it longer than you're meant to. I sat there until the house grew dark around me, the only light coming from the small lamp over the table. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing against the windows with soft, restless fingers. I didn't know it then, but their warnings were not opposites. They were pointing to the same future, just from different sides of it. I didn't speak to anyone that evening. After hours of staring at the object in the sketch, my mind felt stretched thin, buzzing with questions that refused to settle. I tried reading. I tried turning on the TV. I even tried going for a short walk along the gravel road near my house. But every sound in the darkness, the crunch of my boots, the rustle of wind through the dry grass, only made the confusion louder. When I returned home, my living room felt smaller than usual, the shadows heavier. I locked the front door without thinking about it, then checked the windows, something I'd never done routinely before. The house was quiet, but not in a comforting way. More like the silence was waiting for something. I sat down on the couch, placing the object on the coffee table in front of me. For several long minutes I just watched it, the lamplight creating a dull shimmer along its edges. "Who are you meant for?" I whispered. The words felt strange in the air, but no stranger than the days leading up to them. The truth was slowly setting in. Two people, two different people, had gone out of their way to warn me about the same object. One told me to keep it. The other implied that holding it too long would be dangerous. It reminded me of two people standing at opposite ends of the same road, each shouting from their side, neither fully seeing what lay in between. Maybe that space in the middle was me, or maybe it was the object itself. I finally picked it up again. It felt heavier than before, not physically, but in the sense of what it now represented. I turned it over, studying the grooves, the subtle curves. My fingers paused at a tiny mark I hadn't noticed until then. A scratch so fine it was almost invisible unless the light hit it perfectly. It wasn't random. It looked intentional, like a symbol, a line intersected by two smaller lines, almost like a simplified arrow. An arrow pointing where? I held it closer to the lamp, squinting, but the more I tried to decipher it, the more uncertain I felt. My heart thudded in my chest, and the room seemed to close in, the air thick and unmoving. I set it down and leaned back, rubbing my forehead. A part of me wanted to lock the object in a box and bury it somewhere deep in the woods. Another part knew that the first stranger, whoever he was, had spoken with such conviction that ignoring him felt like tempting fate. But the second stranger's warning echoed too. Don't hold on to it longer than you're meant to. Meant to. The phrase haunted me. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter while the refrigerator hummed softly beside me. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to anchor myself in something familiar. That was when I noticed something strange. The clock on the wall, an old one with faded numbers and a quiet ticking sound, showed 9:17. Nothing unusual, until I looked at the one on the stove. 9:12, 5 minutes behind. I frowned. My clocks had always run a little slow or fast, but they never disagreed by that much. I picked up the small digital alarm clock on the counter. 9:14. 3 clocks. 3 different times. I didn't move for several seconds. It wasn't a dramatic difference, but something about it sent a cold ripple down my spine, as if time itself had slipped slightly out of alignment around me. I checked my watch. 9:17, same as the wall clock. I walked slowly back to the living room, glanced at the object on the table, then at the clock above the TV. 9:17, steady as ever. A thought crossed my mind, ridiculous at first, but persistent enough to make my throat tighten. Was this connected to the object? Or, worse, had time shifted around me without me noticing? I backed away from the table and sat down, gripping my knees. The ticking of the wall clock grew louder in the stillness, each second landing heavier than the last. I listened for 5, 10, 15 ticks, counting the rhythm. Then I looked at the object again. It wasn't glowing, it wasn't vibrating, it wasn't doing anything unnatural. It just sat there, silent and ordinary. But nothing in my house felt ordinary anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the heater, watching the ceiling slowly lighten as dawn approached. And every few minutes, My eyes drifted toward the drawer where I had put the object earlier. I kept expecting it to move, or disappear, or reveal something about itself. Instead, it did nothing. Still, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Whatever those men were trying to warn me about was getting closer. I could feel it. By the next morning, I'd convinced myself that the clocks being out of sync wasn't meaningful. Old batteries, bad wiring, a slow drift. Houses accumulate small quirks over time, and mine was no exception. Still, the unease lingered under my skin as I got dressed and prepared for the day. I checked the clocks again before leaving. 2 of them now matched each other. The third lagged behind by a minute. My watch showed something different from all 3. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. Something in the air felt slightly delayed, as if the world took a fraction of a second longer to respond to me. The quiet didn't feel like normal quiet. It felt like anticipation. The morning sky was unusually pale as I drove to work. A soft mist hung low over the ground, thick enough to blur the fence lines and the silhouettes of the barns along the way. It reminded me of the dream. Endless white, distant figures, the strange sensation of sinking. I tightened my grip on the wheel. When I walked into the hardware store, Tom was sitting behind the counter with a cup of coffee, flipping through the inventory list. "Morning," he said, though his eyes didn't leave the paperwork. "Morning." He finally looked up, studying me for a second longer than usual. "You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine," I said. "That's not what I asked." I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed a box cutter and headed toward the back to unpack a shipment of new tools. The storeroom was dim, lit only by a single fluorescent strip that flickered every few minutes. The sound was familiar, a soft buzz, a momentary dip in brightness, and normally I didn't mind it. But that morning, every flicker made my stomach tighten. Halfway through unpacking the first box, I froze. Something was wrong. The sound of the fluorescent light seemed to stretch. Each buzz lasted a fraction too long. The flicker slowed, dimmed, then brightened again in a way that didn't match anything I'd seen before. I glanced at my watch. The second hand paused, briefly, impossibly, before continuing its steady sweep. I blinked hard, convinced I'd imagined it. Watches stick sometimes. Mechanical errors. Nothing supernatural. But the room felt different, like the air itself had thickened. I stepped out of the storeroom, breathing in the brighter, more stable light of the main floor. Tom noticed immediately. "Everything okay back there?" "Light's acting weird," I said. "It's been doing that for months." "Not like that," I muttered. Tom gave me a look, the kind that asked questions he didn't want to say out loud. Before he could speak, the bell above the front door rang. A customer walked in. But this time, it wasn't a stranger. It was someone I knew. Someone from town, someone I'd grown up seeing at school events and gas stations and summer fairs. His name was Marty Kepler. A quiet guy, rarely talked much, kept to himself. In a place like ours, that wasn't unusual. But today, he looked lost. Not confused, not distressed. Lost. His eyes scanned the store like he didn't recognize it. Like the aisles were somehow wrong. Like the tools weren't where they were supposed to be. He didn't even greet Tom. He stepped up to the counter, hands trembling slightly. "Marty," Tom said. "You all right?" Marty didn't answer at first. He just stared at the rows of items behind us, his breathing shallow. "I need," he started, voice breaking. "I need to ask something." Tom and I exchanged a glance. "What do you need?" I asked gently. Marty swallowed. His eyes flicked to me, widening just a little. "Did something happen last night?" he whispered. The way he said it, the urgency, the fear, made my pulse spike. Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" "Something with time." The word hit me like a punch. Time. Before I could stop myself, I stepped closer. "What do you mean, Marty?" He looked between us again, then lowered his voice even more. "I woke up 3 times last night," he said, "and each time the clock beside my bed showed a different hour. Not different minutes, different hours. And I swear," he choked on the words, shaking his head, "I swear the street outside my house was brighter the second time, and darker the third, like it wasn't the same night." My mouth went dry. Tom opened his lips to say something, then closed them again. The store went silent. Marty took a shaky breath. "Something's wrong in this town. I can feel it." I didn't look at him. I didn't have to, because I already knew. He wasn't wrong. Tom tried to brush off Marty's words, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his face. In a small town, people worry about storms, money, and livestock, not about time slipping sideways. But the way Marty spoke, the certainty in his voice, made the room feel smaller. I realized I was holding my breath. "Marty," Tom said carefully, "maybe your clock's just faulty. Happens all the time." "No," Marty replied, shaking his head. "It wasn't that. The whole room looked different each time I woke up. My lamp, its angle was off. The curtains too. And I don't sleepwalk." He paused, voice trembling. "And when I went outside this morning, my porch light was warm. Warm, Evan. It hasn't worked in months." A cold shiver crawled up my spine. "What are you asking us for?" Tom said, trying to sound practical. "I want to know if it happened to anyone else." He said it while looking directly at me. The air pressed against my chest. I forced myself to answer casually. "I haven't noticed anything like that." It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. Not the way the question was framed. I hadn't seen whole hours shift. I hadn't seen the world brighten and darken inside a single night. But the clocks in my house, the strange flicker in the storeroom, the pause in the second hand, the object turning on its own. I wasn't ready to say those things out loud. Not yet. Not when I barely understood them myself. Marty looked disappointed but not surprised. "All right," he muttered, stepping back. "Maybe I'm losing it." "You're not losing it," I said softly. His eyes lifted. There was something raw in them. Fear mixed with relief, like he'd been waiting for someone to take him seriously. For a second I considered telling him everything. The stranger, the object, the warnings, the sketch. But something held me back. Not mistrust, not pride. Just a sense that whatever was happening, it wasn't random, and it wasn't meant to spread. "Take the day off," Tom told him. "Get some rest." Marty nodded numbly and left the store. The sound of the door closing echoed too loudly across the aisles. Tom exhaled slowly. "Poor guy," he murmured. "Always seemed wound tight." I didn't respond, because deep down, I didn't think Marty was wound tight. I thought he was telling the truth, and I thought whatever had happened to him was connected to me more than either of us understood. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Customers came and went, but I barely noticed their faces. Every sound, a hammer clanging, a box dropping, the squeak of the front door, felt distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. My mind kept circling back to one thought. If time was shifting for other people too, then the object wasn't just about me. Something bigger was happening. When my shift ended, the sun was already dipping low. I stepped outside and paused on the wooden walkway, watching the sky turn into muted shades of amber and gray. A chill was settling in, the kind that seeped into your bones. I got into my truck and sat there without starting the engine. The silence was unnerving. Even the wind seemed to have paused. I pulled the sketch from my pocket, smoothing the creases. The numbers 14D stared back at me. I whispered them under my breath, hoping the sound might unlock something in my memory. 14D. Nothing. Just empty air. I started the truck and headed home, the tires crunching over gravel. Every few seconds I checked the rearview mirror. I didn't know what I expected to see. The second stranger, the first one, Marty, or someone else entirely. But the road behind me remained empty. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was the porch light. It was on. The bulb had burned out 2 winters ago. I never replaced it. I never needed it. My yard light was bright enough. But now, the small light above my door glowed with a steady amber warmth, the same warmth Marty had described. Slow dread seeped through me. Slow, heavy, cold. I stepped out of the truck, leaving the engine running for a moment, as if part of me needed a quick escape. But there was nowhere to escape to. Not from this. I approached the house slowly. Halfway to the porch, I stopped dead. The object was sitting on the welcome mat. Not in my drawer, not in my house. Outside, waiting for me. And suddenly, without touching it, without picking it up, I realized something with absolute certainty. Someone else had been inside my home. Or worse, someone who didn't need to use the door. For several moments I couldn't move. I stood there in the cold, staring at the object on the welcome mat as the soft hum of my truck engine rumbled behind me. The world felt unnaturally quiet. No wind, no distant highway noise, not even the usual rustle of trees along the edge of my property. Just a silence so complete that it pressed against my ears. I swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. The porch light glowed steadily above me, casting a warm circle around the mat. The object reflected a faint glint of amber, its edges catching the light like a muted warning. I knelt down slowly, feeling the boards beneath me groan as they always did, though tonight the sound felt sharper, as if echoing too long. My hand hovered above the object but didn't touch it. "How?" I whispered under my breath. There was no sign of forced entry on the door. The lock looked untouched. The windows were intact. And yet, the object, something I had left in my closed drawer, now sat outside, placed gently, almost deliberately, as if by someone careful enough to avoid leaving a mark, or someone who didn't need to go through walls the way the rest of us do. My breath fogged in front of me. I finally picked up the object, the cold metal biting into my skin. The moment it touched my palm, a faint dizziness washed over me. Subtle, like the air shifted half a second behind my movement. I closed my eyes until the feeling steadied. When I stood and unlocked the door, I paused again, listening. Nothing. No footsteps inside. No movement. No presence. Just my small house, waiting. But I didn't trust the waiting. I stepped in and closed the door behind me. My living room wasn't large, just a couch, a coffee table, a shelf with old paperbacks. Everything was in place, except for one detail. The framed photo on the side table, my father on a fishing trip years ago, had been moved 2 inches to the right. Not crooked, not mishandled, just shifted, so precisely that I almost doubted myself. Almost. I walked over and slowly nudged it back to its original position, aligning it with the faint outline on the wood. The sight of that outline, the ghost of a previous placement, made something settle in my stomach like a stone. Someone had been here. Someone who didn't want to be noticed. Someone who knew where I kept the object. I placed the metal piece on the coffee table and sat down, elbows on my knees, palms pressed together. My heart beat louder than the quiet hum of the house around me. The seconds ticked by, too slowly on the living room clock, too quickly on the clock above the kitchen sink. I felt surrounded by things trying to stay normal, trying to hold themselves together. I wasn't sure I could do the same. After several minutes, I picked up the phone and considered calling Tom. He wouldn't understand. He'd try to reason it out, chalk it up to fatigue or oversight, and maybe he'd be right, if not for the strangers, the warnings, the sketch, Marty's fear, and now, this. Instead, I dialed Marty's number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, a shaky voice. "Hello? It's Evan," I said quietly. A breath of relief rushed through the line. "Evan, thank God." I didn't know who else to talk to. I closed my eyes. Something happened at my house. There was silence. Then, "Did your lights change again?" "No," I said. "Someone moved something important." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Marty already sounded tense. "Evan, I don't think this is just happening to us." "What do you mean?" "I talked to Mrs. Lorne earlier," he said. "She said she woke up yesterday and the coffee pot was hot. She hadn't turned it on. And her son asked why she rearranged the living room furniture overnight." A chill crept through me. "People are noticing things," he continued. "Small things, but they're adding up. Like the town is misaligned." I gripped the phone tighter. "Evan," he whispered, "I think time is slipping." I didn't breathe for several seconds. The words were so close to what I had been afraid to admit that hearing them aloud felt like stepping over a threshold I couldn't go back through. "I'll come by," Marty said suddenly. "We should—" "No," I cut in. "Not yet. Let me think." "Are you safe?" he asked. I looked at the object on the table. The faint scratch, the familiar weight, the unknown purpose, and the fact that it had been moved by someone who seemed to exist between moments. "I don't know," I said softly. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Whatever was happening wasn't random, wasn't accidental, and wasn't done with me. Not even close. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed with the object on the nightstand beside me, unable to bring myself to put it back in the drawer where it used to rest. Something about the way it had appeared on the welcome mat, placed so deliberately, made it feel like putting it away again would be an invitation for someone, or something, to move it once more. So I kept it beside me, close enough to touch, but not touching it. The house creaked occasionally as old houses do, but each sound made my skin prickle. I kept expecting to hear footsteps on the porch or the soft click of the front door unlocking on its own. Sometime past 3 in the morning, I finally drifted into a restless half-sleep, the kind where every sound still filters through as if from another room. When dawn crept in, thin and gray, I rose immediately. I checked the door, the windows, the back entrance. Nothing out of place, everything locked, everything normal, except the air. The air felt different again, like the quiet had thickened overnight. I showered, dressed, and left the house with the object in my coat pocket. I didn't trust the idea of leaving it unattended anymore. The thought of returning home to find it somewhere unexpected or missing entirely made my chest tighten. Driving to work, I noticed something odd. It was subtle at first, barely enough to catch my attention. The cattle in the fields along the road stood perfectly still, not grazing, not shifting their weight, not flicking their tails against the cold, just still, like statues. I slowed my truck, watching them through the fogged windows. After a few seconds, one of them blinked and turned its head, as if the world had resumed motion only after noticing my attention. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Something was wrong, more wrong than before. When I arrived at the hardware store, the parking lot was empty. Tom's car wasn't there yet, a surprise, since he was always early. I waited in my truck for a few minutes, hoping he'd pull in, but the minutes stretched and the sun climbed higher. Eventually, I tried the door, unlocked. I stepped inside cautiously. The store lights were off, but faint morning light spilled through the front windows, casting long lines across the floor. I reached for the switch by instinct. The lights flickered once, steadied, then flickered again, slower, heavier, like the room was breathing out of sync. "Tom?" I called. My voice sounded too loud. I moved behind the counter. His coffee mug was there, half full, the steam long gone. The inventory sheet was open, his reading glasses resting on top of it. Everything exactly as he would leave it during a normal morning. Except he wasn't there. I checked the storeroom next. Empty. The small break room. Empty. I was about to step back into the main aisle when I heard something. Soft, distant, like two metal objects tapping together. It echoed faintly from the far end of the store. I felt a cold ripple move through me. "Tom," I called again. No answer. I walked slowly down the aisle, the tapping sound returning every few seconds. When I reached the back corner of the store, I saw the source. A small hand-crank flashlight, a cheap plastic one, sat on the floor, rocking slightly as if someone had nudged it seconds before. But no one else was there. No footsteps, no presence. Just the flashlight rocking back and forth, tapping the linoleum softly each time it swung. I crouched and picked it up. It was warm. Warm, as if someone had held it recently. A noise behind me made me turn sharply. A figure stood at the end of the aisle. Not Tom, not Marty. It was the first stranger, the one who gave me the object. His clothes were slightly different this time. His hair looked a little darker. His expression was the same, steady, sad, resigned. But his eyes carried something heavier, something like the weight of years. "Evan," he said softly. My breath caught in my throat. "You," my voice cracked. "You came back." He didn't move closer. He didn't smile. He just looked at me with a kind of quiet urgency I remembered too well. "You need to listen to me now," he said. I stood frozen. "I told you the object would save you," he continued, "but I didn't tell you the rest." His voice trembled on that last word. "The rest?" I whispered. He closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. "The object doesn't just save you," he said. "It decides when." Time seemed to tilt around me, the room dimming for a split second before returning to normal. "What does that mean?" I asked, heartbeat pounding. He opened his eyes. "It means," he said quietly, "you're running out of it." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The store felt heavier, as if the air had thickened around us. The stranger's presence filled the aisle in a way that wasn't threatening, but unavoidable. Like standing near the edge of a cliff you didn't realize you'd been walking toward. "What do you mean I'm running out of time?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the store, at the shelves, the flickering lights, the quiet emptiness, as though confirming something only he could detect. When his gaze returned to me, the sadness in his eyes had deepened. "You need to understand," he said slowly. "Time isn't consistent around you anymore. It hasn't been for a while." I swallowed hard. "Is that because of the object?" "In part," he admitted, though his expression shifted, like that wasn't the full truth. "The object reacts to changes in your timeline. It responds to divergence, to danger. It isn't a tool. It isn't a device. It's an anchor." "An anchor to what?" I asked. "To you," he said softly, "and to the version of you that needs to survive." The words hit with a strange weight. Not fear, not relief, something in between. I stepped closer. "You keep talking like you know me. Who are you? Why do you care what happens to me?" His eyes flickered, not in surprise, but in pain. "Because I've watched this moment repeat more times than I want to admit." A cold tension ran through me. "Repeat? There are loops, Evan," he said. "Small ones, subtle ones. They correct themselves before most people notice. Hours, minutes, sometimes only a few seconds." He paused. "But with you, it lasts longer. The corrections take more than time wants to give." I shook my head. "This makes no sense." "Why me?" He hesitated for the first time since I'd met him. "Because you're the point it bends around." The lights above us flickered sharply, buzzing with a distorted hum. I glanced up instinctively, but when I looked back, he was watching me with an urgency I hadn't seen until now. "You need to leave town," he said quietly. "Soon. Things will start to escalate. Objects appearing in places you didn't leave them. Hours repeating. People forgetting conversations you swear you had. The anchor shakes loose each time the timeline tries to correct itself. And when it does..." He stopped. "And when it does what?" I pressed. His jaw tightened, as if the words hurt to speak. "When it does, there's a moment where something chooses which version of a life continues, and which one doesn't." My skin prickled. "What does that mean for me?" "It means..." He exhaled shakily. "It means that in some versions of events you don't make it out." The fluorescent light above us flickered again, longer this time. A deep, slow dimming that made the aisles around us blur for a second, as if the room were drifting. When it brightened again, the stranger looked toward the entrance. "They're closer," he murmured. "Who?" I asked. He turned back to me, expression tight. "Not people. Not exactly. Think of them as the pressure of the timeline itself, the part that pulls things back into place." The words unsettled me more than any warning before. "You have to listen," he said, stepping closer now, his voice low but insistent. "The object will protect you, but only if you carry it. If you leave it behind, time may choose a path you can't undo." My hand instinctively moved toward my coat pocket, making sure the object was still there. "Good," he whispered. "Keep it with you for now." He swallowed. "Later? Well, we'll get to later when we can." I felt my pulse in my throat. "What happens next? What do I do?" He looked past me again, toward something I couldn't see. "Right now, you go home. You stay aware. You don't ignore anything that feels out of place. Time won't break all at once. It fractures quietly, like ice." "And you?" I asked. His expression softened with a kind of sorrow that made my chest tighten. "I'll find you again when I can," he said. "If the correction allows it." "What does that mean?" He didn't answer, because the store lights flickered again, once, twice, then shut off entirely. The aisle plunged into darkness. My breath caught. "Where are you?" His voice came from somewhere ahead of me, faint and fading. "Run, Evan." 2 seconds later, the lights snapped back on. The aisle was empty. The stranger was gone, and the air around me felt like it had just inhaled, waiting for what came next. For a long moment, I didn't move. The silence after the lights came back felt heavy, almost physical, like the store itself was holding its breath with me. My eyes scanned the aisle, hoping, foolishly, that the stranger might reappear as suddenly as he had vanished. But the space was empty, still and unchanged, as though he had never been there at all. Except he had, and the echo of his warning clung to the air like cold smoke. I forced myself to step out of the aisle, each movement feeling strangely delayed, as if my body were catching up to time rather than flowing within it. Tom still hadn't arrived. The store remained quiet. The daylight outside filtered through the front windows in muted streaks, and for a second, even that light seemed to waver, just faintly, before steadying again. I reached for the counter to steady myself, but my hand hovered above it for a moment too long before touching the surface. The delay wasn't physical. It was internal, like a half-second lapse between intention and action. The stranger's words replayed through my mind. Time isn't consistent around you anymore. You're the point it bends around. The object decides when. A cold ripple passed beneath my skin. I pulled the object from my coat pocket and held it in my palm. Even in the stillness, it seemed to vibrate with a quiet tension, like a tuning fork caught between frequencies. The scratch along its surface, the symbol I had noticed earlier, caught the light again, sharper than before. I ran my thumb over it slowly. "What are you trying to tell me?" I murmured. Of course it didn't answer. It never did. But holding it grounded me, in a strange way, as if every distortion in the air became slightly more manageable when its weight pressed into my hand. A car pulled into the parking lot. I stiffened, quickly slipping the object back into my pocket. The engine shut off. Footsteps approached the door. For an instant, I expected the second stranger, the one with the sketch, to walk in. But it was Tom. He stepped inside with a small nod, though he looked unsettled. "Sorry I'm late. Roads were strange today." "Strange?" I asked. He set his keys on the counter. Fog was thicker than usual. Couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I swallowed. Off how? Tom hesitated. Like the drive took longer and shorter at the same time. Hard to explain. He paused, then added, "You okay?" Before I could respond, something shifted at the edge of my vision. Not movement exactly, more like a subtle warping of the air, like heat rising from asphalt. It lasted less than a second, but enough for my heart to lurch painfully. "Evan?" Tom repeated, stepping closer. I blinked, the distortion fading. "Yeah, I'm fine." But my voice sounded thin. Tom didn't push, but his eyes lingered on me. Concern, confusion, worry, all layered over each other. I exhaled slowly. "Tom, did you see anyone here earlier? Anyone at all?" "No," he said. "Why?" I looked toward the aisle where the stranger had been. "Just checking." Tom sighed. "Listen, Evan, if something's going on..." The store lights flickered again. Both of us looked up. This time the flicker wasn't a quick stutter. It was slower, almost intentional. The light dipped into a dim, amber glow, the shadows stretching long across the floor. The hum of electricity deepened, vibrating through the aisles. Tom frowned. "That's new." I felt the same cold ripple move through me again, the same tightening of the air. The object in my pocket grew colder. The world seemed to tilt, very slightly, as if the building were rocking on its foundation. "Tom," I whispered, "don't move." He froze. "Why?" I listened. The hum in the lights deepened, warbling the way a record bends under heat. Then, a brief silence. Too brief. A gap that felt like a breath taken by something unseen. The lights snapped back. Everything looked the same, but felt wrong, slightly misaligned. Tom rubbed his arms. "What the hell was that?" I opened my mouth, closed it again. "A correction," I whispered, without meaning to. Tom frowned. "What?" I shook my head quickly. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The stranger's message echoed inside me. Time fractures quietly, like ice. My heart pounded. The walls around me looked ever so slightly. Shifted. A nail on a poster. The angle of a shelf. The shadow beneath the counter. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just different enough that only someone paying attention would notice. The object pulsed faintly against my leg. Just once. Like a single heartbeat. Tom didn't notice. But I did. Because the stranger had been right. I wasn't just caught in whatever was happening. I was at the center of it. And the fractures were beginning to show. I left work early that day. Tom didn't argue. He barely looked at me, as if even he sensed that something just beneath the surface of the world was shifting in ways neither of us could name. The drive home was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you but instead amplifies every small sound inside your own mind. I kept one hand tucked into my coat pocket, fingers brushing against the cold metal object whenever my nerves spiked. By the time I turned down my gravel road, the sky had taken on a strange color, washed out gold along the horizon, fading into a pale gray that didn't look entirely real. It reminded me of a photograph left too long in sunlight, the edges fading before the center. I slowed the truck, scanning the fields on either side. The cattle weren't frozen anymore, but they moved with a sluggish, delayed rhythm, almost like the world around them was lagging a step behind. I parked in front of my house and cut the engine. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel. The porch light was still on, glowing steadily. It felt wrong to see it illuminated. Wrong because it hadn't worked in years. Wrong because now it appeared to shine with a warmth that felt almost aware. Eventually, I forced myself out of the truck and walked toward the house. Every crunch of gravel under my boots made me flinch. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the shift in the air. The house wasn't empty. It wasn't occupied either. It was something in between, like it held an imprint of someone who had been there moments ago, someone whose presence hadn't fully faded yet, a trace, a memory, or maybe a shadow of time itself trying to catch up. I closed the door and locked it behind me, my fingers shaking slightly. "Okay," I whispered to myself. "Just breathe." I walked into the living room. Everything looked normal at first glance, but as I moved deeper into the space, details began to reveal themselves. The photograph of my father on the side table shifted again. The curtain by the window, drawn halfway when I always left it fully open. The rug by the door, angled slightly to the left, as if someone had stepped on it while turning. I swallowed hard. Someone, or something, had been inside again, and not long ago. I sat down on the couch, running both hands over my face, trying to steady the trembling that had crept into my limbs. I wasn't afraid in the way most people imagine fear. There were no loud noises, no dark figures, no direct threats. This was a different kind of fear, quiet, thoughtful, creeping. The kind that settles in your bones and whispers that something is fundamentally out of place, and that you are too. I pulled the object from my pocket and laid it on the coffee table. The metal seemed darker than before, the groove sharper, the faint scratch-like symbol more pronounced. I traced it slowly with my fingertip. "You were in that drawer," I said softly, and then on the porch. And now, I didn't finish the sentence. Instead, I reached for the phone on the wall and dialed Marty again. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice low, strained. "Evan, I think someone was in my house again." He exhaled shakily. "Me too." My breath hitched. "What happened?" "I came home and my curtains were open," he said. "I never opened them. And my old clock radio, Evan, it was playing music. It hasn't worked in years. The parallels hit too close to ignore." "Do you think it's connected to everything else?" I asked. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think it's all connected to whatever's happening to time." Neither of us spoke for several moments. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, fear, and the crushing realization that this wasn't something we could outrun. "Marty," I finally said, "have you seen anyone? Anyone strange?" "No," he said, "but I feel like someone is watching the gaps, like something slips between moments and looks out." My stomach tightened. He had put into words the very feeling I had been trying not to name. "I don't think we're supposed to understand this," he continued, "but I think you're at the center of it, Evan." I closed my eyes. I already knew that. The object's cold presence in my hand confirmed it with a weight that felt almost alive. "I'll call you later," I told him softly. "Evan, be careful," Marty said. "The more things shift, the less the world feels stable." "I know." I hung up, my gaze returning to the metal object on the table. For the first time, I understood the truth in a way I hadn't before. Time wasn't breaking around me. It was rearranging me, and the object was the only thing holding back whatever came next. I stayed on the couch for a long time after hanging up with Marty. The object lay in front of me, silent and small, but somehow occupying more of the room than its size could justify. Outside, the sky dimmed into a muted blue-gray, and the last light of day thinned across the living room floor like a fading memory. I didn't want to turn on the lamps. I didn't want to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. The world around me felt fragile, as if one wrong action, one misplaced gesture, might fracture it again. So I just sat there, watching the shadows lengthen. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I needed to check the house again, not because I expected to find anything, but because not checking felt worse. I walked slowly down the hallway, glancing into each room, bedroom, bathroom, spare room. Everything looked normal, almost painfully normal. as though time itself had rearranged things neatly behind me, erasing whatever had been standing in those changed positions moments ago. When I returned to the living room, the object was no longer on the coffee table. My breath snagged in my throat. I scanned the room quickly. Floor, couch cushions, table edges. But it wasn't there. Panic surged through me, cold and immediate. I felt my chest tighten as I knelt and checked under the furniture. Nothing. I reached into the pockets of my coat. Empty. Not again, I whispered, voice shaking. I took a step backward, and my heel touched something. I turned sharply. The object was sitting directly behind me, placed gently on the floor as if someone had set it there in the seconds I wasn't looking. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Okay," I said aloud, trying to steady myself. "All right." The house felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls had leaned in by an inch. I knelt down slowly and picked up the object. It was colder than before, so cold it almost burned. I held it between both hands, warming it with my palms until the biting chill faded. The symbol carved into the metal seemed deeper now, almost etched with intention, not wear. For the first time, I felt like the object wasn't just reacting to me. It was responding. I sat back down, cradling it carefully. "What do you want me to understand?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Seconds passed, maybe minutes. I wasn't sure. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but the rhythm felt wrong, slightly lagged, like each second carried more weight than the last. A soft vibration pulsed in the house. Not a sound, more like a shift, as if everything around me inhaled, paused, and exhaled in a single, almost imperceptible wave. The air moved with a faint pressure, brushing against my skin in a way that felt intentional. I froze. Then the vibration came again, stronger this time, a deeper tremor running through the quiet like a ripple in unseen water. I stood up quickly. "What is happening?" A faint hum rose from somewhere behind me. I turned toward the hallway. The lights flickered. Not the usual flicker, not the soft dimming I had seen before. This was a slow pulse, on, off, on again, each shift accompanied by a slight delay, as though the electricity struggled to decide which version of itself to follow. My mouth went dry. I gripped the object tightly. "Okay," I whispered, backing toward the front door. "Okay, just stay calm, stay aware." But the house wasn't responding normally anymore. With each step, I felt the air thicken. The hallway stretched before me, not physically longer, but perceptually deeper. Like time inside that hallway moved differently than the rest of the house. I didn't dare walk through it. Instead, I turned toward the window beside the door and pulled back the curtain just enough to look outside. The world beyond the glass flickered. Not the lights, the world, the trees, the fence line, the distant mountains. Everything strobed for a fraction of a second, as if existence were trying to correct itself and failing. I stumbled backward. A third vibration rippled through the air, stronger than the first two. The floorboards trembled gently beneath my feet. The object warmed suddenly in my hand, the first time it had done anything but sit in silence. Then, a soft sound behind me, like a footstep. I turned slowly. My living room looked the same, and yet unmistakably shifted. The photo of my father was back in its original place, the curtain fully open, the rug aligned, all the small disturbances corrected at once, as if time had snapped to a preferred version of the moment. But I didn't feel relief, because the house wasn't empty. It wasn't full. It was suspended. I whispered into the stillness, "I know you're here." The air stirred slightly, like a breath moving past me. The object vibrated once, faint and certain, and I understood whatever was coming next. I wasn't meant to stop it. I was meant to survive it. I stood completely still, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The air was thick, trembling with a faint pressure I could feel in my chest more than in my ears. The living room no longer felt like a familiar space, but like a moment stretched too far, pulled thin until it trembled. Every shadow looked too sharp. Every quiet sounded too loud. The object in my hand warmed again, a slow, steady heat that traveled through my palm and up my arm. I tightened my grip around it. It wasn't glowing, it wasn't vibrating, nothing visible or dramatic, but it felt alive, present, aware. Then the lights went out, not flickering, not dimming, just gone. The house fell into a soft, colorless darkness. I could still see the outline of the furniture from the faint glow seeping through the curtains, but everything felt hollow, like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe again. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Another soft footstep sounded behind me. This time it was unmistakable, slow, delayed, as if the step was unfolding in pieces across separate seconds. I turned, moving cautiously, expecting, I don't know what, a figure, a shadow, a stranger stepping out from behind the thin veil of time separating us. But the living room was empty, and then I realized something far more unsettling. The sound hadn't come from the floor. It had come from the moment itself, like time replaying a fragment out of order. The object warmed further, urging me, not with force, not with a pull, but with a deep instinct, to step back. So I did. The air in front of me shimmered faintly, just for a second. A distortion, a warping of the space between the coffee table and the wall, like heat rising from a road on a summer day. Except this wasn't heat. This was something else, something wrong. The shimmer grew sharper. I staggered back another step. Then the world lurched, not violently, not with noise. It felt like a misstep, like the floor had moved a fraction of an inch sideways. The walls stretched, then corrected. The ceiling dipped, then rose back into place. The whole room shifted in a quiet, impossible way that made my stomach twist. I whispered, "Please, stop," and the distortion paused, like it heard me. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The object in my hand pulsed once, deep and certain. Then the distortion collapsed inward, folding into itself like a bubble popping. The air snapped back, the lights flickered on, and I found myself standing several feet to the left of where I'd been a second before. I hadn't moved. The world had. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I placed a hand on the wall to steady myself, my breath unsteady, trembling. I looked around the room. Everything had corrected itself again. The picture frame, the curtains, the rug, all aligned, as if the distortion had reset reality to avoid tearing it. But something else had changed too. Something I only noticed when I looked toward the doorway that led to the hall. A faint outline marked the air, like a fading imprint of a figure. Not detailed, not even clear, just a silhouette. Not human exactly, not solid, but present. It hovered there for less than a second, then dissolved into the stillness. Time was watching me, or something within it was. My knees weakened. I sank onto the couch, the object resting in my open palm. Its surface was warm now, warmer than my own skin, and the small carved symbol felt almost sharp, as if etched anew. I realized something then, something quiet, but undeniable. The object hadn't protected me from an outside threat. It had protected me from a correction, from the timeline choosing a version of events where I didn't remain. The stranger's words came back to me, soft as breath. It decides when. You're the point it bends around. I swallowed hard. For the first time, I understood what he meant. Not intellectually, but deeply, painfully. The world around me wasn't stable. Time wasn't stable. And whatever had just happened in my living room wasn't an attack. It was a decision, one I barely survived. The object had kept me anchored, kept me chosen, kept me here. I closed my fingers around it slowly, feeling its weight settle into my palm. My living room looked normal again, perfectly normal, but I didn't trust the stillness anymore. Not the silence, not the light, not the minutes ticking away softly on the wall clock, because now I knew the truth. Time wasn't just slipping. It was choosing, and for reasons I still didn't understand, it wasn't done choosing me. I didn't leave the house that night. I barely moved from the couch. I sat there with the object resting in my open palm, the warmth slowly fading into something neutral again, as if whatever moment it had intervened in had passed. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing gently against the siding, whispering in soft, uneven breaths. It sounded almost like a reminder, quiet, persistent, unwilling to let me pretend nothing had changed. In a way, nothing looked different. The living room lights glowed steadily. The photographs sat untouched. The world outside continued as it always had. But I felt the difference in the space between seconds, in the subtle drag in the air, in the faint wrongness lurking beneath each moment. It wasn't something I could point to or prove. It was something I felt, deep in the center of my chest. where a truth settles long before we have the words to name it. I knew then that time would keep shifting around me. Not constantly, not violently, but quietly, in small ways most people would never notice. I would see clocks drift, rooms misalign, objects move an inch or two from where I left them. Maybe others in town would sense it too. Maybe they already had. But the anchor, the object, connected itself to me for a reason. It wasn't finished, and neither was the story entwined with it. I think about the stranger often, his sadness, his certainty, the way he said again, as if all of this had happened before, maybe dozens of times, maybe hundreds. I sometimes wonder how many versions of me he had watched disappear into a correction I hadn't felt, hadn't survived, hadn't even known existed. But in this version, in this quiet moment of my small Montana house, I'm still here, and that has to mean something, even if I don't yet understand what.